So anyhow, I want to welcome Paul Thompson here today to talk in our ACSM's Distinguished Leaders in Sports Medicine and Exercise Science series. We've done 30 to 40 of these, Paul, and I'm glad you could come and join us and do this. And one of the one things I just wanted to start with was where you're at now, what are you doing now, and what kind of projects you're working on, and sort of a present thing, and then we'll go back and sort of talk about how you got there.
Great. Well, thanks. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to do this. I think it's kind of a nice thing that the college is doing it, to kind of talk to people and see what the college has influenced them and things like that. So I'm Director of Cardiology at Hartford Hospital in Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford Hospital is a very large, 600 to 800 bed hospital.
I didn't know it was that big, Paul.
With a big cardiology division, and it's well endowed. And I came there just about 12 years ago. So I'm the Director of Cardiology, and I enjoy that job a lot. I'm also Professor of Medicine at the University of Connecticut because Hartford Hospital is one of their bigger teaching institutions.
Okay.
Right now, my NIH support comes from a grant that's looking at the muscle effects of statins, the myopathic effects of statins. I don't think anybody has any doubt that statins are really revolutionary for managing cholesterol, something I've been interested in a long period of time. But statins also have some side effects on muscle, and we're particularly interested in kind of the mild side effects. You can get rhabdomyolysis from statins, but...
And what is that, Paul?
Rhabdomyolysis is actually almost like the melting of muscle.
Oh,
Rhabdo
wow.
means skeletal muscle. Wow. Lysis means breakdown. So some people, for not totally clear reasons, when they're treated with statins, will have breakdown of the skeletal muscle.
I see.
It releases a lot of enzymes and kind of noxious proteins into the blood, so it can cause kidney failure and death. Wow. With one of the statins, there were 100+ deaths reported, so it can be a problem. But about 10% of people treated with statins get muscle aching. So we're interested in the aching, and we're also interested in muscle strength, whether people actually have a loss of muscle strength with statins, and it's not very well examined.
Study.
It's very interesting. Then we also have a lot of industry support. We do a lot of, because I'm a cardiologist, we do a lot of studies with drugs for pharmaceutical companies that relate to heart disease. And it's good for us because it allows us to do those studies to get money when we're, when times are lean. And then we also have a collaborative study that a fellow named Eric Hoffman, who's a molecular biologist. Eric Hoffman and I started about, probably about 10 years ago now, and it's called FAMOUS, for Functional Assessment of Muscle, muscle strength and size. And that was basically a study in which we took, an NIH study, we took 1,200 people. We had them exercise with their non-dominant arm for 12 weeks to see how big we could make the muscle and whether there were genes that predicted those changes. So those are the sort of things we're working on.
Yeah.
We're actually very well funded now. And
so how do you have the time? I mean, you're seeing patients,
yep,
but it sounds like you have time to do.
So my patient responsibilities are I'm blessed, Jack, by having really good collaborators. For example, there's a woman that works in my lab, a woman named Beth Parker, who's a PhD from Penn State. She runs most of the studies. I have wonderful research nurses that recruit people. I have some great exercise physiology masters people.
Great team.
And great collaborators. Yeah. Priscilla Clarkson from the University of Massachusetts has been a good collaborator. Linda Pescatello from UConn has been. And they've been great collaborators.
Both ACSM people.
Both ACSM people, and people that I wouldn't have known except through ACSM.
Yeah.
So my present schedule is I see patients on Monday and Thursday all day. I do about 8 to 12 weeks of coverage in the coronary care unit and in the consult service. So I have not a small load, but I've always enjoyed working. So most of the stuff I do with research is done nights and Saturdays.
Sure, yeah, I know the feeling.
I'm sure you do.
So what about? Let's go back a little bit, Paul. Where did you go to high school? Did you play sports?
Very interesting, yeah. And actually, it's for me. I've actually been blessed in that I've been able to combine my interest in distance running. And I still try to run the Boston Marathon every year. So my interest in kind of competitive athletics with medicine, so that I'm very interested in problems of athletes and their cardiac problems. And I guess I didn't mention that, but because we don't have any grant support in that. But we're also, a lot of the people that I see in my clinic are actually athletes from all over the country who have cardiac problems. So I went to Danvers High School. My father was the Baptist minister.
In Connecticut?
Massachusetts.
Oh,
North of Boston,
yes,
Danvers.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay.
So my father was the Baptist minister in Danvers High School, in Danvers, Mass. I went to Danvers High School, which was just the public high school, but got a great education. In fact, I was able to place out of I get advanced placement in 3 college courses out of that little high school. Wow. And I went to Tufts, which is in Medford, Mass, and I went to Tufts Medical School. I was an intern and resident at the Tufts New England Medical Center. Did 1 year in the cardiac catheterization lab, doing cardiac caths at Tufts New England Medical Center, and then went to Stanford for 2 years. Okay. After that, I came back to Brown, and I was on the faculty at Brown University for 14 years, and a very seminal thing happened. I met a guy named Peter Herbert, who was a lipid guy who had trained at the NIH with very famous lipid people, Fredrickson, Levy, very leaders in the field of lipid metabolism. And I wanted to do some studies, so I did a study. A graduate student came to me from the University of Rhode Island, and he needed a study. And so I suggested that we measure lipid levels in me and a bunch of my friends before and after the Newport Marathon. So we measured them the day before the marathon, we measured them immediately after, 4 hours after, the next day, and then for the next 2 days. Now what we found was that if the average triglycerides were 96 the day before the race, and on the day after the race they were 33. They went from 96 to 33 milligrams per deciliter. Then 2 days later it was 66, and then back to baseline. So Peter, this lipid expert, had never seen such pronounced changes in triglycerides so acutely. So that started a series of studies.
When was this, Paul?
1978.
Okay.
I moved to Brown in 1978. That fall, the Newport Marathon, and what I was running the race. I was still running competitively. And I should point out that, in Danvers High I ran.
I was going to go back and ask you that.
So I ran cross country Danvers High, and then I ran at Tufts, and I kept it up through medical school because in fact, what I did is I would run to work. So even in medical school, in 1972, I wanted to run in the Olympic trials. So my wife consented to our renting a house 6 miles from the hospital. So I would, during my 3rd year of medical school, no matter what the weather was, I would run to that hospital. And I could get off at 11 at night, and I would run home. And I can remember calling her once. It was like, 1 in the morning, and I'd just gotten off. And I said, Camilla, can you come pick me up? And she said, no. You were the one who wanted, I'm going back to bed. You were the one who wanted to do this. So you run home. So I ran home, and I think I had to be back at 7 the next morning. So.
And that was a time, too, that jogging, running, whatever you want to call it, wasn't really that popular yet.
It was becoming popular.
Is that
it really was.
Because, early 70s.
Right, because the year I tried to run in the Olympic trials was I ran in the Olympic trials was 72. The year I tried to make the team was 72, and that was the year that Frank Shorter won. Yes, so it really blossomed after that.
That's right.
But the late 60s, there was a lot of interest in track and field, and my father was very interested in track and field, and so that combination was very useful. So, and also recruiting research subjects for these studies of distance runners. And during some of our early studies, we took distance runners, and we made them run 10 miles a day, and we fed them all their meals. Now, I was always a subject, so that was one less subject that I had to recruit. And
pay.
And pay, right, because we were paying them $10 a day. So it helped with it. So the whole thing started with my getting this association with this lipid expert, Peter Herbert. And then he taught me kind of lipid physiology, where there weren't many cardiologists who knew a lot about lipids. So when statins came around and it became easier to treat lipids, I was almost immediately a lipid expert, not because I had started in lipids, but because I had started in exercise.
It's funny how things happen.
And I'll tell you one other thing that's kind of an interesting thing, is that when I was at Stanford, and I ran the Beta Breakers in 1977, I believe it was, and somebody died in that race. And I was very interested in that. That was quite shocking to me. And there was a guy at Stanford named Michael Stern who had collected some runners who had dropped dead. He had collected this group, but he hadn't had the time to write it up. So he asked me if I would write it up, so I took and collected a few more, and there was a total of 18 runners who dropped dead running. Now this was the time when people thought, oh, if you can run, you're never going to have a problem. So that was published in JAMA in 1979.
Wow.
It was
I
supposed
knew you did recent things like this, but I didn't know it was as early as
so
79.
1979. Now here's what happened, and this just goes to show luck. Jimmy Carter was president, and I don't know if you remember, but he went jogging and he ran in a race, and he kind of got heat stroke.
I
and
saw
the
picture of
front
him
cover of the New York Times.
sort of collapsing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I
My
remember
paper
that.
was supposed to be published the next week, but JAMA, you know, wanting the publicity, said we will release this paper early. So here's Jimmy Carter on the front of the New York Times, and my paper on the front of the New York Times. And I'm simply pointing out that a lot of the stuff that happens to you in life and in science and in careers is not simply something that you can, what do they say? Life is what happens to you while you're planning your career. You know, it just kind of happens. Stuff happens.
Yeah.
It just kind of happened to me, and I've had a lot of things like that that have been very lucky.
Call it good timing.
Good timing, but it was really luck. And then a couple years later, in 1982, when I was at Brown, it became clear to me that there was only one medical examiner in the state of Rhode Island. So that medical examiner, Bill Sterner, and I collected everybody who dropped dead jogging. So we were able to get a numerator in the state of the Rhode Island as a denominator. So in 1982, we published in JAMA a paper on how many joggers died per number of joggers.
Was that the Rhode Island
Yes.
Jogging?
That was the Rhode Island jogging study.
Yeah.
And, and there haven't been a lot of studies like that since then, so it's kind of stood the test of time. But the point of this story is this. In 1984, Jim Fix dropped dead jogging.
I remember that one. That was
So we had the only paper, or there was one other by David Siskovic, but there were two papers at that time on this topic. And so, you know, again, you get kind of media attention because Timothy Johnson from ABC came and interviewed us, and, you know, then people start to know you.
And I remember, too, more recently, the basketball player,
Len Bias.
Lenny Bias.
And just before that, we had published a paper on
Yeah.
cocaine causing myocardial infarctions. And that was it. I don't remember exactly when in the 1980s, but I had one patient who was 21, and he came in with a heart attack after getting cocaine as a wedding present, believe it or not. So he got this cocaine, he sniffed it, you know, went to the hospital instead of to bed, you know. So it was not,
timing,
it was not a great wedding night, I suspect. But, and so when Len Bias died, again, you know, these things, it's kind of just having the right place at the right
I
time.
remember that one very well because I had gone to Maryland, and I think he was a Maryland.
It was Maryland. He was a
Yeah.
Maryland basketball player,
Yeah.
Len Bias.
Yeah.
And I remember it because I'm a Celtics fan, having
Yeah.
grown up north of Boston, and he messed up the franchise for a long. That was a #1 draft pick.
Yeah, he would have made a difference.
Yeah, he would have made a difference.
Yeah.
And he was also, by everybody's account, a good guy that probably just got drawn in on the wrong night.
So when you were at Brown, were you practicing your cardiology then
Yep.
at a
Yep.
hospital? Or
Yep.
how's,
The
what
Miriam
was that
Hospital.
set up? Okay.
So I've always worked in kind of semi-academic positions. I had an appointment at Brown, but I was actually paid for by the hospital.
Okay.
And it's same thing when I left Brown in 1992 to go to the University of Pittsburgh, where I was for 5 years. And the same situation there. I had an academic appointment, worked for the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and now I have an academic appointment at UConn. But I'm actually paid to run the Division of Cardiology by Hartford Hospital, and I'm very grateful to them for employing me.
What, do you get to teach some classes then, or seminars or anything?
Yeah,
or,
what we basically have is we have cardiology fellows. So most of the teaching that I do is not in a lecture format, but a
Pretty
consult service.
one-to-one
So you're a
in a lot of-
patient. We come see you, we talk about your problem, and I say to the resident, well, what do you want to do? And the resident says, I want to do it that way. And I say, well, here are the things that I would do, taking care of that patient, and we decide how to do it. So it's more, medicine is more taught as an apprenticeship.
Yes, rather than a lecture or something. Yeah.
In fact, I think really it's one of the problems that's happening in medicine in these days is that the time that there are now time restraints on how much time an intern and resident can spend in the hospital. So it's their experience of taking care of patients is less because you can't keep them there as much.
Yeah.
Can't torture them like you used to.
I think that's probably not a good thing.
It's a mixed blessing. It's a mixed blessing because I think it allows them more balanced lives, but I think it exposes them to fewer patients. I mean, I remember, taking care of patients most of the night.
Yeah.
And not thinking I was the worse for wear for it the next morning.
Mm-hmm. That builds character, right?
Well, maybe. My father always used to say that he would rather be a character than have some.
Right.
So.
Well, one of the other things, Paul, I wanted to talk to you about was the American College of Sports Medicine and your association with it. You were a president in the late 90s.
Yep.
And how did you get involved with this group? And for a cardiologist, there were some early cardiologists, but you don't not necessarily think of it as a place where a cardiologist might end up.
Well, I tell you, it's been wonderful for me. And the people that got me into it were really Bill Haskell and Peter Wood, but primarily, Peter Wood was at Stanford as well, but primarily Bill Haskell.
Did you meet Bill when you were out at?
Right, and I went to Stanford to finish my cardiology training because Bill Haskell was there. I wouldn't have gone for any other reason.
I didn't know that. So you really knew about him and went there and...
I knew about him, and I knew also that I wanted to try to combine my interest in competitive distance running with my interest in cardiology. I mean, I selected cardiology because it was one of the few places in the late 80s that did exercise testing, for example.
Okay.
And I was very interested in exercise and health. And so I went to Stanford because Bill was there, absolutely, no other reason. And so I think it was 1976, or it could have been 77, or whenever we were in Washington, maybe 76, that I went to my first ACSM meeting. Okay. And didn't miss a one until last year for all that time. Now, and I really regret missing last year, but the division, there were so many things going on in the division I couldn't get away. Yeah. But for me, Jack, I'll tell you what it's been very useful. Because, for example, our grants in statin muscle injury comes partly from knowing about that statins injure muscle, but also from knowing that exercise injures muscle. So for me as a cardiologist, I can come to the American College of Sports Medicine meeting and I can get exposed to things that wouldn't be discussed at cardiology but like have applications. Now, for example, I went to a thing today on fatty livers, steatohepatitis. It's becoming an epidemic in the country. It's probably related to insulin resistance and other things. But it's also probably emerging as related to the ultimate development of heart disease, because if they're both related to insulin resistance. So I could go to a lecture today about fatty liver that I would not get at the cardiology meetings. So for me, the American College of Sports Medicine has been physiology, not as basic as I would get in some of the physiological societies, but just right for me as a clinician. Because there's some very basic stuff presented here, but there's also stuff that's more to my level. So it's been very useful for me.
Yeah, I can see that. That's what Angela was saying. There's a lot of clinicians that have echoed that same sentiment, that there's something here that they can learn about or learn from that they wouldn't get elsewhere.
I think that's true. And I actually think the college has done a very good job over the past 10 years, much better than when I was president. I mean, it's really progressed so that the sessions for clinicians are very good. The sessions for, and you know, you can go to, if you want to just be a clinician, you can go to the clinician stuff all the time. What I'll do is I'll go to some of those in cardiology, the ones that interest me, but I'll spend a fair amount of time in some of the more basic science stuff because, you know, like the things that the people at Missouri are doing in coronary blood flow and whatever, it's very interesting to me. Neat stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about was when you were sort of on the board and then working your way up to the presidency and so forth, was there any good things, bad things, any issues, or was it sort of smooth sailing? Because Whitehead was in place then, and
I think there were issues with finances. I remember in the mid-90s that there was when Steve Van Camp was president, for example, there was a fair amount of concern about exactly how we were doing financially as an institution. And so I think that was a source of concern, and until we got a more stable sort of you know, with the publishing and with some of the other things that we were doing, you know, there were always some financial issues. So those were the things that concerned me coming up. Also, I think there was a period of time in which the science got diluted. Now, at this meeting, the science I thought is excellent, and every year that I've been as of late, the science was excellent. But when I was president, one of the things that I was really trying to emphasize is that we almost got a little bit too much applied health. We should have some applied health. But we need that balance to make sure that we attract folks like myself who want to hear good basic science, but also so to keep the basic scientists coming, but also the applied people. So if I look at the college historically, I think there were two things that were important from my point of view. One was the the financial issues in the mid-90s, and the other thing was the balancing of the science versus the epidemiology, public health sort of stuff.
Yeah. This came up at the business meeting. Angela Smith actually brought it up, and she reminded everyone that they should keep the science part strong, that some people thought that sort of the social policy stuff was getting too out of hand, and I think it was interesting for a lot of people to see a clinician stand up. And,
was that at this meeting?
Yes.
It was interesting.
Yeah,
I didn't make the
Thursday
business
morning.
I didn't make the business meeting.
Yeah.
But I totally support Angela's point of view. I thought the science at this meeting has been very good. One other thing that I think has been an issue over the years that I still think is worth revisiting is the whole idea of reviewing abstracts versus not reviewing abstracts. Because I do think you improve the quality of abstracts when they're reviewed. We tend to accept them all. If they're sponsored by a fellow, the fellow is supposed to review them. That is a comment that I get a lot of times from scientists about whether we should re-examine that. And quite frankly, why we stopped it years ago, as you know, was we stopped it primarily because it was a very hard thing to do with mailing out these abstracts.
Just so many.
There's so many. But now, some of it's, for example, for the American College of Cardiology, we review them all right on the web. So it's relatively. So
with that, it could be re-looked at.
I actually think it's something that people mention to me. The abstracts at this meeting can be more variable than the science presentation, the colloquium and the lectures and the invited lectures. But all in all, I think I'm quite pleased. I'm very pleased with my experience at this meeting.
Oh, that's good.
Got great notes and learned a lot.
Oh, the weather's been nice too, if you ever get outside.
Hey, Jack, I'm a very serious guy. I haven't been going outside. I've been staying at the meetings.
So dark room.
That's right, a dark room with lights.
Well, anyhow, thank you so much, Paul.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.